welcome back, not loudly, not urgently, just precisely. You didn't arrive here randomly. The civilized people. Moments like this don't happen by coincidence. They happen when something inside you has already moved. Quietly, subtly, before your mind fully caught up. You came because something changed. And once it changed, there was no returning to the version of you who didn't notice. For a long time, you told yourself a gentle story. A reasonable one. A forgiving one. You said people mean well. You said misunderstandings are normal. You said patience solves things. You said maturity requires tolerance. You said healing is personal responsibility. So if something felt off, you assumed it was you. You didn't accuse. You didn't confront. You reflected. People, you adjusted your tone. You softened your words. You questioned your reactions. You replayed conversations in your head long after everyone else had moved on, looking for the exact sentence, the exact expression. People, the exact moment where you might have done something wrong. You convinced yourself that if you became calm enough, understanding enough, self-aware enough, everything would eventually settle. And while you were doing all of that, while you were growing, regulating, restraining, another reality was unfolding quietly beside you. Not loudly, not dramatically, nothing you could point at and say, there. That's it. Just subtle shifts. Private conversations you weren't part of, expressions that changed when you weren't present, versions of you that returned distorted, unfamiliar, filtered through someone else's interpretation. At first, you dismissed it. You called it overthinking, stress, fatigue, paranoia. Because when you're already emotionally exhausted, these civilized people, it feels safer to doubt yourself than to question the intentions of people you once trusted. But quiet patterns don't disappear just because you refuse to name them. They repeat. They echo. They leave marks. You began noticing how warmth cooled, but never fully vanished. People, how support became conditional, offered, then quietly withdrawn. How concern sometimes felt less like care and more like observation. You noticed how honesty was met with silence, but silence was analyzed. How your openness felt risky, but your restraint was interpreted. How questions about your well-being felt less curious and more diagnostic, like someone was checking symptoms instead of listening to answers. And slowly, without anyone ever announcing it, a role began forming around you. You didn't choose it. You didn't claim it. It was assigned. You became the sensitive one, the complicated one, the one who's going through something, not because you demanded attention, not because you expressed instability, but because that version of you was being quietly assembled elsewhere, piece by piece, in conversations you never heard. Here's the part most people don't realize until much later. While you were focused on growth, others were focused on narrative. They weren't asking, what's actually happening? They were asking, how do we explain this in a way that feels comfortable? So they compared notes. They interpreted your pauses. They explained your behavior to each other, simplifying you, flattening you, until you fit neatly into a role that required no further examination. Not out of cruelty. That would have been easier to detect. but out of something far more subtle: the need to feel certain. Uncertainty makes people uneasy, and instead of sitting with it, they resolve it by assigning meaning. Someone becomes grounded, someone becomes rational, and someone quietly becomes the problem. These civilized people, because it wasn't done in your presence, it happened in tone, in implication, in how your absence was discussed more than your presence. And the most disorienting part wasn't the judgment itself. It was the split reality. They could smile at you, check in on you, offer advice, speak gently, while holding a completely different version of you internally. That fracture did something to you over time. You began doubting your instincts, explaining yourself before anyone asked, clarifying things that were never directly questioned. You weren't reacting to words. You were reacting to what you could feel beneath them. That's what makes this experience so exhausting. There's no confrontation, no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it broke. Just a slow erosion of trust in your own perception. You wondered if you were imagining it, if you were projecting, if maybe you really were more difficult than you realized. And in that uncertainty, you did what introspective people often do. You internalized it. You took responsibility for emotional weather you didn't create. You carried guilt that wasn't yours. You tried to become smaller, quieter, easier. You believed that if you adjusted enough, the tension would dissolve. But here's what no one tells you. Some dynamics don't heal through effort. They reveal themselves through distance. What you were dealing with wasn't a misunderstanding to clarify. It was a pattern that relied on your participation, and the exposure didn't come through confrontation. It came through exhaustion, not anger, not resentment, just tiredness. At some point, something inside you stopped reaching. You stopped explaining. You stopped chasing clarity from people who thrived on ambiguity. You stopped offering emotional access to those who kept translating it into something else. You didn't announce your withdrawal. You didn't dramatize it. You simply became quieter, and that quiet changed everything. Because silence removes material. Without your reactions, there was nothing to analyze. Without your openness, nothing to reframe. Without your presence, narratives began looping, repeating themselves without new input. You didn't disappear to punish anyone. You disappeared to protect yourself. And in that space, away from interpretation, your mind began clearing. Memories started aligning differently. Moments that once felt confusing began making sense when viewed together instead of in isolation. You noticed how often you were responding to implication instead of reality. How frequently you were managing expectations that were never clearly communicated to people. How much energy you spent maintaining emotional equilibrium for others. And slowly a realization settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. You were never failing at connection. You were outgrowing a dynamic that required you to remain uncertain in order to function. The heaviness wasn't because you were broken. It was because you were being positioned. Positioned as the emotional variable, The one whose reactions could be discussed, instead of the environment that provoked them. The one who carried tension so others didn't have to examine their own discomfort. Once you see that, something irreversible happens. You stop needing permission to trust yourself. People, you don't require agreement for clarity to be real. Peace doesn't come from being understood by everyone. It comes from no longer negotiating your reality to make others comfortable. And this awareness doesn't make you distant. It makes you clear. Clear about what you engage with. Clear about what you no longer carry. Clear about the difference between connection and access. You're not closing your heart. You're closing the door on dynamics that depended on your confusion to survive. And just when you think that's the end of it, something else becomes visible. Distance reveals truth faster than confrontation ever could. Without you stabilizing the system, and cracks appear, stories shift, details change, new tensions surface. Ones that existed long before you were blamed for them. That's when it becomes undeniable. It was never really about you. You were a convenient place for unresolved discomfort to land. A mirror others didn't want to face. A container for tension that didn't belong to you. You begin to understand something crucial. They didn't need you to be wrong. They just needed you to doubt. Because doubt keeps people reachable. Doubt keeps them explainable. Doubt keeps them orbiting. As long as you question yourself, you stayed accessible. As long as you searched for reassurance, you were predictable. As long as you remained open to reinterpretation, the narrative stayed flexible. But certainty is uncooperative, and you didn't become certain overnight. It happened quietly. It happened the day you didn't rush to correct a misunderstanding. The day you let an assumption sit without dismantling it. The day you chose rest over resolution. That was the moment you stopped feeding the dynamic, not out of spite, out of clarity. You began to realize something else too, something subtle but powerful. Not every version of you deserves your participation. Some versions exist only because you kept showing up to defend them. And when you stopped, those versions were left unsupported. Right at the moment where certainty begins to settle, these civilized people, right before the full weight of that realization reshapes how you move through the world. And once you stop showing up to defend those versions of yourself, something strange happens. The noise fades. Not immediately, not cleanly. At first, there's discomfort. A reflexive urge to step back in, to clarify, to explain, to smooth things over. Because for a long time, harmony felt like your responsibility. If something felt tense, you believed it was your job to fix it. If something felt misunderstood, you assumed you hadn't communicated clearly enough. That instinct doesn't disappear overnight. There are moments where your hand almost reaches for the door you already closed. Moments where silence feels unnatural, like you're neglecting something important. But then you pause, and you notice something different. You notice that the tension no longer spikes inside your body the way it used to. You notice that your breath stays steady. You notice that you're not replaying conversations afterward. searching for mistakes. That's when it becomes clear. What you felt before wasn't intuition failing you. It was intuition being drowned out by obligation. When you step back far enough, patterns become visible in full. You begin to see how often you were reacting not to what was said, but to what you sensed was expected of you. These civilized people, how often you adjusted your emotional temperature to match the room. How frequently you made space for interpretations that never made space for you. And the realization lands gently, but decisively. You weren't confused. You were over-accommodating. There's a difference. Confusion seeks clarity. Accommodation seeks safety. You weren't unsure of yourself, people. You were trying to survive a dynamic that quietly required you to remain flexible, explainable, available. That's why certainty changed everything. Because certainty doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't chase understanding. It simply stops participating in what no longer makes sense. And that's when the system reacts. Not always loudly, sometimes subtly. You might notice fewer check-ins, different energy, a shift in tone. Or you might notice the opposite, sudden concern, unexpected outreach, vague attempts to re-engage. Not because something healed, but because distance disrupted the pattern. People, when you remove yourself from a role, the structure that depended on it starts to wobble. That's not your responsibility. You're not obligated to stabilize environments that destabilize you. And the more you resist the urge to explain your absence, the more grounded you feel. Because here's the truth most people never say out loud. Not everything deserves clarity, people. Some things reveal themselves, only when you stop trying to understand them. You begin to trust what your body knew long before your mind caught up. You notice how certain names no longer create the same emotional reaction. How memories that once felt sharp now feel distant, like echoes from a room you've already left. That's not numbness. That's resolution without conversation. What hurt you most wasn't what they said. It wasn't even what they did. These civilized people. It was how long you stayed trying to make sense of something that was never meant to be explained to you. These civilized people, you were trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces shifted every time you looked away. Trying to reach clarity with people who benefited from your confusion. Trying to heal in an environment that quietly required you to stay unsettled. That wasn't weakness. That was loyalty misdirected. You brought depth to places that only offered surface. You brought sincerity into spaces that survived on assumption and interpretation. And for a long time, you blamed yourself for the imbalance, not realizing you were operating from a different level of awareness entirely. Here's the part that changes everything once you truly see it. They didn't need you to be wrong. They needed you to doubt. Doubt keeps people accessible. Doubt keeps them explainable. Doubt keeps them within reach. As long as you questioned yourself, you remained open to reinterpretation. People, as long as you sought reassurance, you stayed predictable. As long as you believed harmony was your responsibility, you stayed invested. But certain people, these civilized people, certainty disrupts that. Certainty doesn't demand agreement. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't justify itself. And that's why it feels threatening to dynamics built on ambiguity. You didn't become distant out of bitterness. You became distant out of clarity. You realized that not every version of you deserves access. That not every misunderstanding requires correction. That not every silence needs to be filled. People, some versions of you existed only because you kept explaining them. When you stopped, those versions collapsed under their own weight, and something else emerged in their place. Stillness, not emptiness, not detachment. Stillness, the kind that comes from no longer being internally divided. You start choosing your words differently, not because you're afraid of being misunderstood, but because you no longer feel the need to over-deliver clarity. You notice how peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply arrives when you stop negotiating with what hurts. And there may still be moments where old instincts resurface. Moments where you feel the pull to explain yourself, to reach back, to make things comfortable again. That's normal. You trained yourself for a long time to believe connection required sacrifice. But now you're learning something deeper. Mutual understanding requires mutual honesty. Without it, your effort only creates imbalance. So you let the urge pass. You breathe. People. You ground yourself in what you know now. You know that people who genuinely care don't require you to abandon yourself to be understood. You know that clarity doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from observation, from stepping back far enough to see the entire pattern, not just your role inside it. And once you see the pattern, you don't try to outrun it. You step out of it. That's where a different kind of strength takes form. Not the kind that argues, not the kind that proves, the kind that holds steady without explanation. You stop announcing your boundaries. You live them. You stop seeking validation. You trust your alignment. You stop reacting. You respond when it matters. These civilized people. And here's the quiet truth that settles in with time. Your life doesn't require witnesses to be valid. You don't need consensus to move forward. You don't need permission to protect your inner world. You don't need to be understood by everyone to be at peace. Some people will never understand the version of you that chose peace over participation. They'll call it distance. They'll call it coldness. They'll call it change. Let them. Their interpretation no longer defines your reality. You know what it took to get here, bull. You know the nights you spent questioning yourself. You know the emotional weight you carried silently, hoping things would eventually feel lighter. And now they do. Not because someone apologized, not because the story was corrected, not because closure was handed to you, but because you stopped carrying what was never yours. You're allowed to move forward without dragging the past behind you for context. You're allowed to outgrow dynamics without explaining why. You're allowed to choose peace, even if it confuses people who benefited from your unrest. This isn't disappearance. It's consolidation. People, you're gathering your energy back into yourself, redirecting your attention toward what nourishes you. Building a life that doesn't require constant self-translation. And as you stand here now, calmer, clearer, more rooted than before. There's one final truth to carry with you. You didn't lose anyone. These civilized people. You found yourself. You found the version of you that doesn't need to be interpreted to be real. The version that doesn't negotiate its worth. The version that understands the difference between being open and being available. From here on out, the way you move through the world will feel different. Lighter, quieter, intentional. Not because you closed your heart, but because you finally learned where it belongs. And that awareness, once it takes root, changes everything.